And we're live with our 79th episode of Absolute AppSec, and the first one we've ever done at a conference live. We've got Aaron Reinhardt and Shannon Leeds here with us. I think the theme, by the way, Steph, is there anything you want to talk about?
No, I'm all good.
You're good.
Thanks for hosting us, James. This conference has been super awesome so far, and we're just glad to be here and see everyone. So yeah, let's just dig into it. I know we don't have a lot of time today, so we'll just jump straight into the topics.
The future. So 2020 is
yes,
fast upon us. We've talked a lot about, or the speakers have talked a lot about today, about like empowerment, enablement, guardrails, automation, all of these things. So I guess the main topic we want to address is, what do you two see in the DevSecOps/AppSec sort of world? What's changing, and what do you predict for the next couple of years? We won't go too far, but we'll say.
Yeah, I mean, Ken and I definitely have our opinions on this, but we wanted to hear what you guys thought was coming down the pipes and kind of what you see for the next year, maybe 2 years in that space, what we should be concerned about. So,
and thanks for agreeing very last minute to come up here.
Yeah.
By last minute, we mean 5 minutes ago. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Oh,
yeah.
there
we go.
Wow.
Kelly, yes.
Thanks a lot. Okay, I dropped my phone. That was good. So what's going to happen in the next year or two? Is that the time? So I think that what's happening right now in the industry is we're starting to see more and more people talking about security in applications, talking about security in their workloads, and you're seeing a greater adoption of things like the cloud. The cloud, if you look at AWS or Azure or Google, they started adding a ton of security features there. So you're seeing developers have many more options to choose from and to get educated about. That seems to be increasing the ability for applications to now have more resiliency when it comes to adversaries. So I'm seeing a little bit more focus, especially for the applications that are moving to the cloud. I think that's going to keep moving up. You're seeing additional security features being added in that area. That seems to be knocking down the problems of making it more ubiquitous for the industry. And then I think, over the next few years, more of an adversary focus. So you're seeing a lot more people talking about things like RASP and when somebody's scanning you and who's actually doing it and why are they doing it. So you're starting to see some of that come together. I think eventually you'll start to see some of the threat intel players starting to migrate their way towards providing that information so that developers could take advantage of it in more real time. Observability is becoming a big deal right now. So I'm hoping that the observability players who are starting to really try to put some effort and investment there actually understand that their key opportunity is really highlighting adversary information as well, because developers really need the ability to understand what their adversaries are doing so that they can plan for the security features they might need and not overdo it or underdo it.
Okay. Sure. Can I borrow that just for a second?
So is it sort of like a situation, and I'm sorry about that, we have 2 months. So is it sort of like what you're saying? Is this like the Datadog and New Relic, how developers use those metrics and that exception logging, or that information to then decide how to improve their applications? And is that sort of the idea?
So the idea would be that if you're looking at the end of the line with your security, you have more capability to look at not just your customer path, but your anti-path. So looking at your adversaries, figuring out what they're doing, and trying to pull that information together in a way that makes it so you can make decisions that are actually customer focused, but not giving advantage to an adversary.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And you're right. Like with AWS, with these cloud vendors, with GitHub, we've definitely seen like a lot more security-centered tooling. What's your take, Aaron?
I'm just going to kind of add to what Shannon said. I think, when it comes to observability, it's not just a buzzword, right? And in terms of security, we're really hurting on the observability side of things. And let me clarify the point. What I mean by that is that how do you know when something fails? All we ever really see is footsteps in the sand, right? That's a general spot quote, but through log events, through tracing, right? But what about all the log entries that are written? I mean, where do they come from? Right? Where do log entries come from? Software engineers write them. What do software engineers prioritize? Features and functions, right? So what about all, so I love the security vendors out there that will tell you, they'll take all your data and they'll shove it into a data lake, and they'll do some, or the big data solution will do some, prediction based upon that data. But you're assuming you have all the right data to begin with, right? Like,
That's true.
I have not right now. I've tried to solve the software security logging problem. I was at United. I went after it in several different iterations. It's very hard. It is hard to catch up in that space. I've only talked to a few people that had really good answers. One was Jason Chan at Netflix. He didn't say he gave up on it, right? He said they try to pull context. He said we're tackling the problem differently. Try to pull context where from places we already know we have good information, and pull more information and enhance the log data. So that's one area. Two, I think this is self-serving to say this a little bit, but I think chaos engineering is really going to have a big impact in security. You're already starting to see that. I'm really starting to see that. Third, I want to come back to something that James Domenico sort of exacerbated last summer. They took a quote from Shannon and I. Basically, when I was at United Health Group and she's into it, we both sort of we made security people learn how to code, it really pissed a lot of people off, right? Like, we made this claim that, the world is dominated by software, right? Like, if you don't understand how software it works and is made, it's very difficult to make it secure, right? Like, when I did that at United, I got so much great feedback. I learned that a lot, actually, software engineers so the development goal was that everyone in security had to learn Python, right? I can't remember what year it was, like 2016.
So Perl. No.
Sorry.
Whoa.
No, but it was great though. It's like some of the compliance people came to me, my peers were like, Aaron, are we going to all become software programmers? I was like, no deal. Nobody wants your code, right? It was really about creating empathy, right? When you have to download Python inside the corporate app store to upgrade it from 2 to 3, right? And then it takes 4 days to get your request back to get it done, right? People start seeing how things are painful, right? When they start eating their own food. So I'll stop there. So.
No, that's a pretty common discussion point that we have about being AppSec people, right? The best AppSec people are ex-coders, right? That's where both Ken and I kind of came up from. And I think a lot of people in this room as well. So probably, how many people here are developers? Or claim to be developers, or former developers, we should say.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a few of you. We won't get into the whole, other debates that go along with that, Ruby. Anyway.
Wait, some of the greatest exploit code is written in Ruby.
Yes, some of the greatest exploits are in Ruby. Against Ruby? No.
Oh,
sorry.
Probably both.
These are digs at me. Just
Yeah.
so you know. Digs at me.
Ruby guy.
I was going to say, wait, I should be sitting next to you.
No. It's all good. So, and to go back to some of those other points, let's see. Maybe we'll just move on.
So the one last thing we want to get your take on before we have Karthik and James Schaefer come up is last week we had Clint, or was the week? No, it was 2 weeks ago. We had Clint Gibbler on the podcast. He said something which I think really resonated with us, is that the sort of like the good AppSec shops or the good security shops are not trying to catch all the vulnerabilities, but systematically, one by one, eliminate whole categories of vulnerabilities. So
and this goes to what you were saying, Aaron, about logging, right? Rather than trying to solve, hey, we've got one log that's coming from this one application, we're trying to solve the whole class of security logging. And the good organizations are the ones that are focused on the whole class, not the single exploits. You think about the industry in general, from bug bounty and everything else, it's very single exploit focused, or single, like even problem focused. And we don't look at the full class, right? We don't look at authorization as a whole. We think about maybe, function level access control or insecure direct object reference. We're not necessarily approaching the whole problem. And we just kind of wanted to get your take on that as far as.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, are there any classes of vulnerabilities you think just won't go away, that are just too difficult of problems to solve? Or does this strategy sound like a pretty sane approach in your opinion? I know that's a lot to put you right on the spot to think about, but yeah, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Ladies first.
No, go ahead.
Okay, the only thing I was going to say is like, when it comes to vulnerabilities and isolation, I mean, like the way we're building software today and the complexity inherently in the microservices, public cloud, and continuous delivery, when you combine those things, you now are delivering software at such a scale, such things are changing at such a speed, and the way things interoperate are very disparate. It's a new problem set. And it's like, we're now in a world where it's difficult to understand the system behavior to begin with, let alone understand and find any kind of security problems. And security, it must understand this problem is coming, because when your system is changing and scaling and as fast as I'm talking about, like it becomes very difficult to ensure that the feedback loop to ensure there is a feedback loop that your security is remaining effective.
I couldn't agree more. I can tell you the end of last week for me was a true testament to what you just said. The systems have gotten so complex that even for developers and for myself and for security team, like I can honestly say that was the tail end of my week last week was exactly what you just talked about. So that's super relevant. Yeah.
And I think it's about understanding whether or not perfection is even an option. If you look at investment and trying to make software happen, this notion that we're going to have perfect software is probably a little bit flawed.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how resilient does your code have to be? In what scenarios? I still go back to the way that you solve this problem is whole classes of categories of vulnerabilities, but with an adversary mindset and bent towards it. So if you're going to design your applications a certain way, which adversaries are you trying to prevent? What things are they using against you? All of that goes into the science of being really good at this. And I don't see that yet in the security industry as a means of trying to make things come to life for a developer. But I would say developers themselves could actually do that by simply looking into what exactly are these folks doing that's actually counter to what I had planned to do with the functionality.
So are you talking like a mini? It almost feels like you're talking about a mini threat model or something like that as you're building out a system or an application.
So I call them attack maps.
Okay.
So the idea is, you have customers, you have a pipeline for acquiring customers, and the idea is that when you're dealing with your application, you're creating your application, you're also acquiring adversaries. You should understand why you're acquiring those adversaries. They're coming because of something that you have in your application, something that you invented. It could be a business logic flaw. It could be something that just makes that opportunity come to life. And understanding that pipeline and the conversion process will help you to stay ahead of the breaches if you put that kind of thing in place. So it means you can't just use scanners or testing capabilities without having context of your application.
Okay, so
We're going to close it out. Ben, bring up Karthik and change. And Andrew Schaefer. I can't read, whatever. And I'm dropping phones. So, I did want to say thank you to both of you for coming up here. And I want to continue what you just said is super relevant to follow up. We want to talk about architecture design, but I think that's super smart to prioritize the class of vulnerabilities you're trying to mitigate based off of what your actual risk is, like you said, sort of incorrect. So,
Yep.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you.
So
Thank you for
coming up
last
here
minute
and answering questions so thoughtfully and intelligently. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And it was very nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks. Nice meeting you guys.
Sorry, I got your
I'm so memorable.
No.
Do we have mics or?
Yep. So
These two.
sharing is caring.
So sharing is
It's a baton. It's a relay race.
So we've got Karthik and we've got Andrew. We're going to go right into where we left off, which was talking a little bit about, I kind of want to back home to what we're as security people doing. So we just talked about prioritizing what you fix in your application and your systems based off of adversaries. One thing that we've seen come up a lot recently and like a sort of a trend is instead of the role of AppSec or SecOps being strictly like we'll say doing reviews or running scans or whatever, pushing more into helping with design principles and architecture and sort of all the guardrails and automation that we've talked about. So the question I guess that we have is, expanding upon that, like what else do you see as a trend with our jobs? What's changing? Where should we be focused in the next, again, 1 to 2 years?
2 years. Yep.
Great, I have Mike. Well, so traditionally it feels like we're pushing more towards doing training and tools more left.
Yeah.
But really, what I think makes more sense, and when James and Ernest and I used to work together a long time ago, we all had different titles, but we were working on the same team, and we would collaborate on the architecture of the system. So from a dev perspective, I understood the architecture of what I was trying to build out. From an operations perspective, Ernest was like, hey, this makes sense from a observability, monitoring, like all of those principles, and James looked for more security kind of principles in there. So it wasn't like, hey, you must be using specific tools to do security, or you must be using specific to do actual collaboration around the stuff we're actually building. That makes a lot more sense. And I'm hoping, I know we have a lot of movements and we have a lot of things we talk about, but I'm really hoping that that's kind of where teams collaborate on, and that's where we go towards.
I would claim to be an expert. Been involved with a lot of automation projects and definitely collaborated with the security experts. And I think that the patterns that we'll see in the next few years, not everyone will get there. That's the other thing you got to realize is not everyone's on the same trajectory. Like the understanding and the access to these tools is not evenly distributed. But at some point, you get past, we're going to sit and collaborate with different roles and put that farther left to, we're going to, especially at scale, and you see what I consider some of the cloud native security approaches, you have to bake the security as a first class consideration into the libraries and services that you're using. So just like you have, people talk about site reliability engineering, but if you look at what's happening inside of a place like Google, there's kind of like security engineering built into those libraries too, right? Yeah. So there's like site security engineering. And then as a developer that's kind of focused on a business domain, I don't have to think about security as an expert. I know if I use these libraries these ways, then they'll keep promises about how it uses the infrastructure, they'll keep promises about security, reliability, and the rest of the other abilities that I want to keep promises about.
So I mean that sounds more, or it sounds very similar. Like some of the talks were addressed kind of this pattern-based approach to security. That the industry at large is developing these patterns, or even bespoke patterns within your organization that actually say, this is how we do security. This is what applies for us. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
I mean, in some sense, all those patterns start as bespoke, right? Like
Yeah.
There's a curve of innovation where you see these patterns that are bespoke, but then they emerge as a dominant way to solve problems, and then they become commoditized. And so that's what we're seeing with all of this cloud movement, is things that were embedded and bespoke inside of these kind of companies are becoming more and more accessible to the rest of the industry.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's where we have advantages that we're sharing things, like I'm thinking about the Neiman Marcus guys, that tool that they just released, but also all the stuff that's coming out of Netflix, right? It becomes kind of this standard, and then, AWS just goes and writes it into the code somewhere, and that's why we have reInvent, right? Yeah. Or they can take over those industries. But, yeah, so I would tend to agree with that, right? Like from a consulting perspective, I see that quite often is, I'll get into one organization and they have something that they're doing really well, and then you kind of spread that around, not necessarily the code or their proprietary, instructions, whatever. It's more the kind of the approaches that we take. I mean, you're seeing a lot of that at GitHub, are you not?
Yeah. Sorry, do you mind if I borrow?
So, yeah, I'd say we're definitely seeing that. We're also seeing a weird shift where, my role's in application security, and we're also seeing this weird shift to where we can't just focus on the code and the applications anymore, and we have to focus on the code as infrastructure and the actual infrastructure itself. And it's this weird place right now, and I feel like it's not just us; it's a lot of people
where you're having to you now need to know about the cloud, Dockers, and containerization, and end to end. You're not just looking at just the code writing it, like the code running on the infrastructure. You're looking at end to end everything, because it all plays a part. So especially when you talk about risk, like Shannon was talking about, and determining what people would be going after, and then trying to, what you talked about, security engineering libraries, or build, like we keep talking about, guardrails to people.
And yeah, language is also really important. I'll give you an example. So like for us at Oracle, we have a nice team, but when I first joined the company and we were releasing a product, it was really scary to go do a security review before we release things. And once we kind of went through the process, it was interesting to kind of see some of the tooling that they used. We built this internal tooling that relied on containers, and we were releasing stuff. And we were a container team, so it was like, oh sweet, this is actually like a language we understand. And we started talking about architecture and stuff like that. So we went from a big scary thing to like a common language of here's how, from a security point of view, we're using, we built out this platform, and we were able to give them insight on, hey, you actually should be doing this other thing instead to build this platform out, et cetera. So there's shared understanding.
So my focus really for the last 10 years has been trying to help people deliver IT with better tools and processes. There's a part that's kind of evolved through. People call that DevOps or what have you. But a lot of it comes down to the human behavior. And you talked about collaborating, with Wicket and sort of that process. So if you work at GitHub, I believe there is a project that's happening right now to do some prototyping with a upstream Spiffy Inspire, which is basically getting per microservice identity, which is very interesting when you start to think about the kind of security implications of being able to trace what each individual microservice did. If it starts to misbehave, you could decide that that's the one you want to shoot in the head or what have you. So maybe the two humans that are concerned with these things at GitHub should meet each other and talk about it. And maybe you could help those people think a little different about the security implications of that, and maybe learn something about some of the interesting stuff they're doing on the networking and routing, ingress egress stuff with the Kubernetes stuff. So
yeah, there's definitely a lot of interesting there's definitely a lot of interesting initiatives along these lines, and some of those
people keep doing stuff.
Yeah, people keep doing stuff. Well, no, you see I think it's pretty common now for people to be breaking out of the monolith, and it's been common for several years now, at least several years. But to have the visibility and and I know you've talked about service to service authentication extensively. And those are just super not easy to solve problems of tracking everything, having the visibility, but also doing everything securely and talking between services and all that fun stuff.
But this is the pattern I'm talking about. Is those are going to become commonly shared libraries. Yeah. That will be not just shared in that org across the industry. So if there's a framework right now that gave you out of the box the ability to manage that identity and the policy, then you'd use it, right?
Yeah, of course. Who wouldn't, right?
Spiffy Inspire, it's right there. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have to wrap it up because we are going to bring on Jerry Gamblin and Cat Sweet next. And so I just wanted to thank you both. Again, anybody that comes up here with last minute questions, they don't know what they're going to answer.
Yes, it's the musical podcast.
Yes, it's the musical podcast. Thanks. Cool. Thanks, guys. Jerry, Cat. Hi.
Hey.
Come on. Sorry, I know it's a lot last minute. But thanks for doing it. Yeah, surprise podcast.
Surprise podcast.
Surprise musical chair podcast. That's what we're doing. We know Jerry. We have never met, but it is nice to meet you, Kat. So where do we want to go from here? I guess is the question.
I still think seeing what people's opinions are on where we're going. Right, the next 1 to 2 years, kind of what you're seeing, because everyone's in a different organization, everyone's dealing with different problems. Like what I see from consulting, what you see from GitHub is obviously a different.
Jerry, data collection.
Yeah, Jerry with data collection. So let's stick with that, right? Where do you see the DevSecOps space going for the next 1 to 2 years? What should we be concerned about?
Sure. Let's go first.
Go for it.
Okay.
All right. So DevSecOps is dead. We're just gonna start calling it Dev again, or Dev Biz. I'm of a strong mindset that DevOps started with the development team and the business teams getting together and complaining enough about the ops teams that
They just eliminated the ops teams.
that they say, okay, Dev, you can do ops now too, so you're DevOps. And after they knocked out the ops team, they come for their next biggest enemy, which is security.
Yeah.
So now you're DevSecOps, and that's done. And I think it's the moving to Dev Biz, where it'll be a dev team following business goals really tightly, and that will be the team in most organizations in the next 2 to 5 years, especially with the cloud providers picking up a lot of the heavy legwork.
Yeah.
And automation.
So you hear that, James? For next year, it's just Biz Days.
We're gonna work on that.
Okay, good. All right.
So we're gonna work on the branding.
Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome.
Good.
You mean it's not going to get longer? DevSec, test, QA, infra, help desk, sales, ops?
Biz.
Biz. Yeah, that's why we're all here anyway. From the security side of things, one thing that I started to see shift a little bit is with certain security options, there's this usually a bit of a divide between like corporate security, the stuff we use, like our infrastructure, our accounts and stuff, and application security, ones that align with engineers, focusing on the stuff we make. And I see the lines starting to blur a little bit. That was even something I was encountering as I was getting ready to leave my last role, is we found ourselves working in parallel quite a bit between the AppSec and the corporate security teams. So there's a bit of as we get more infrastructure as code, and as we get more the gray area between what we're building and making and what we're using, I think those are going to converge a little bit.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I totally agree. And it's just interesting how all of our, actually, out of curiosity from the crowd, who does traditional security ops, like networking type? So one, DBA stuff, database administrators, application security, or software development. Yeah. What? Okay. So I'm trying to figure out who just did. We'll just say just generic security in general. Okay. Interesting to get a read on the demographics of the room. I wanted to go back to data collection.
Yeah.
So what's like the typical use case currently for folks who are like using your product, for instance?
Yeah. So the use cases, and I have an Ignite talk here in 5 minutes to talk about this, is that you have to use the data to make yourself smarter, because there's way too many CVEs now for anybody to patch or to care about. And then I'll show the numbers. I don't want to lead my talk and
we don't want to ruin your talk.
And give all the best data, but there are very few CVEs that the average person should care about in this room. And if you're not using some kind of threat intelligence to get rid of the majority of CVEs that come through your systems, or to put them off, you're not going back to helping the business. And at the end of the day, DevSecOps is a business enabler, and that's what we're all here for, is to help the business meet their goals. It's not to help security meet their goals. So
yeah, if the business doesn't have a business, then we don't have jobs, right? So
cool. Yeah, I mean that kind of goes back to I know we've talked about this before, Jerry, with if a breach happens and no one cares or no one notices, did it really happen, right? The same thing is with CVEs. If you watch the number they're coming out, like what's being actually reported on a daily basis, if you track that at all, there are just massive amounts of them. Yeah.
Well, and GitHub just released a new tool where they're going to auto open CVEs for any filed security bug starting last month, actually. So you're going to see the number of CVEs like quadruple in 2020.
It's becoming automated, and
yes.
So at which point, like, how do you know what you care about, right? So that's exactly what you're saying. Okay.
So what are some of the biggest challenges you face in your day-to-day work?
So So I recently left security operations a couple months ago, joined Capsulate as a member of their product team's tech evangelist. And so I think one of the things that, since we're Linux endpoint detection and response, one of the challenges that we try to bear in mind is exactly what I talked about in my keynote. How do we do this without breaking production? Like, how can we be mindful of ops and bake that in instead of trying to retrofit it? So again, things like resource limiting and like not using kernel model. So it's kind of a challenge of making a product and coming up with solutions that are kind to both security operations and DevOps, because those two are often it can be really hard to find tooling that pleases both.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to, when I say they, let's clarify, DevOps is trying to move quickly. And like you have both spoken about, you're trying to build a business and you're trying to make money. And with security, it's, friction sometimes, right? That's sometimes. It sounds like, from what if I had to summarize everything that I've heard today, it seems like removing friction is like the #1 priority going forward. And just something that everybody we've talked to today is pretty focused on. So, but accomplishing it in different ways for sure.
Yeah, and it's going to depend on the organization, obviously. So, okay.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, I think another thing too, kind of on similar lines, is you have to sort of embrace some of the friction sometimes. One of the things that's pretty top of mind for us is the fact that the environments we're working with are often really complex. They're not as straightforward as they used to be. People have like bare metal, containers, VMs, all different flavors of operating systems, all the things. So how do we solve for that?
So we are now, we actually have to close it out.
Yeah.
We don't want to, because the next speaker is coming up. So we want to thank you both and for coming on and giving us your thoughts, and to the audience and anybody out there viewing the podcast.
Anybody listening?
My mom.
Yeah.
So, anyways, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, thanks for having us. And yeah, if you didn't hear